The phone rang at 7:43 in the morning. Not a gentle buzz. A full, loud, aggressive ring that cut straight through the sound of cartoons playing in the living room and the smell of pancakes warming on the stove. Soren Adeyemi didn't move at first. He stood at the kitchen counter with a spatula in his hand, wearing a faded gray shirt and house slippers that had seen better days, watching the screen light up on the table beside the fruit bowl. The name on the screen wasn't saved. Just a number. Long formal. Starting with the area code he'd spent 13 months learning to forget. He let it ring. 3 times. 4. Then he picked it up. Mr. Adeyemi? The voice on the other end was professional. Measured. The kind of voice that worked in institutions, hospitals, law firms, places where people delivered news they didn't feel personally responsible for. This is St. Aurelius Medical Center calling on behalf of our paternity notification protocol. We're required to inform you that the registered biological father listed in your children's medical file has been formally notified as of this morning. The spatula slipped. It hit the floor with a sharp crack and bounced twice before settling against the cabinet base. Soren didn't pick it up. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, one hand pressed flat against the counter, the other holding the phone against his ear so tightly that his knuckles began to pale. Sir? Are you still on the line? Yes. His own voice surprised him. Calm. Controlled. Something he'd trained himself to sound like over 13 months of rebuilding what had been publicly torn apart. I'm here. The notification was sent as part of a routine medical update. Your children were flagged in our system following last month's wellness visit. Standard protocol requires that both listed guardians receive. I understand. He cut the call. He set the phone down. He did not move for a full 30 seconds. From the living room came the sound of small feet hitting the floor. Then a crash, something plastic, probably a toy, and then laughter. High, clean, unself-conscious laughter that belonged to children who had no idea the world had just shifted underneath them without their permission. Soren pressed both hands against the counter. Breathed in once. Breathed out slow. He knows now. That thought moved through him not like fear exactly. More like the memory of fear. Like a scar that doesn't hurt anymore until the weather changes, and then it aches in ways you forgot were possible. 13 months of silence. 13 months of building something quiet and real in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city, far away from press conferences and packed councils and a marriage that had been dismantled in front of cameras like a performance. 13 months of nobody calling. And now, this morning, with pancakes on the stove and cartoons on the TV, someone had made a phone call that hadn't been his to make. He turned off the burner, plated what was already cooked, carried 2 small plates into the living room and set them on the low table in front of the couch where his twins, Zara and Kofi, sat cross-legged in matching dinosaur pajamas, completely absorbed in something animated and loud. Zara looked up first. She was 5 years old and she had her father's eyes, large and still and watching everything. Papa, why'd you drop the spatula? It slipped. You never drop stuff. I do sometimes. Kofi didn't look up from the screen. He was already reaching for his fork. Is there syrup? Kitchen table. Soren sat down on the arm of the couch. He watched them eat. He watched the way Zara chewed with exaggerated seriousness and the way Kofi hummed quietly to himself between bites. And he let himself sit inside that moment for as long as it would hold him. Hi viewers, here's a question I genuinely want you to answer in the comments. If you found out someone from your past was just informed of something that could bring them straight back into your life, would you run, stay, or stand your ground? Because Soren had already run once. He'd left quietly, with 2 children and 3 bags and the kind of dignity that only comes from having nothing left to lose. He wasn't running again. But standing still, that was its own kind of war. He was still sitting there, working out exactly what he was going to do next, when Zara looked up again with her fork paused midair and her eyes doing that thing they did, that searching, too old for 5 thing that always made his chest tight. Papa. Yeah, baby. She tilted her head just slightly. Who's coming? By 9:30, There was a van parked across the street. Not obviously. Not with a logo on the side or a satellite dish on the roof. Just a dark gray panel van sitting 2 spaces down from the fire hydrant. Engine off. Windows tinted just enough. Soren noticed it when he went to the window to check the weather before getting the kids dressed. He stood there for a moment with the curtain held slightly back, watching it. Then he let the curtain fall. He had maybe 2 hours. He knew how this worked. He'd learned it the hard way, in a courtroom lobby with flashbulbs going off and people he didn't recognize shouting questions at his back. Media didn't show up alone. They came in waves. First the scouts, then the vans, then the anchors with their blow-dried certainty and their hot takes already written before they'd spoken a single word to you. He got the children dressed. Fed them again, they were always hungry. Made sure Zara had her inhaler in her jacket pocket and that Kofi's shoes were on the right feet, which was a battle he fought and lost at least 3 times a week. He was buttoning Kofi's jacket when the first knock came. Not at his door. At Mrs. Patterson's door down the hall. He could hear it. 3 sharp raps and then a voice, smooth and practiced. "Ma'am, do you live near Soren Adeyemi? We just have a few quick questions." Mrs. Patterson's response was immediate and extremely clear. She had lived on that floor for 22 years, and she did not appreciate uninvited visitors at any hour. The door shut hard. Soren straightened Kofi's collar. "Stay close to me today," he said. "Both of you." Zara was watching him with that same still attention she'd had all morning. "Are we going somewhere?" "Maybe." "Where?" He opened his mouth to answer. And then he heard the elevator. Not the mechanical groan of it arriving. He knew that sound, but something else. Footsteps. More than one set. And a quiet between them that wasn't the quiet of people who didn't know each other. It was the quiet of people who moved together without needing to speak. Coordinated. Deliberate. He knew that quiet. He'd spent 3 years inside it. The hallway outside his apartment went completely still for exactly 4 seconds. Then someone knocked. 3 times. Unhurried. Soren set Kofi down gently. He straightened up. He crossed the apartment and stood at the door for one full breath before he opened it. Caius Okonkwo filled the doorframe the way he always had. Not through height alone, though he was tall, but through something that had no clean name. His brothers flanked him just slightly behind, Darius on the left and Zeke on the right, both of them dressed like men who had come from somewhere important and intended to return to it shortly. Nobody was smiling. Caius wasn't looking at him yet. He was looking past him, into the apartment. Then his eyes moved, settled on Soren's face, and something passed across his expression. Not warmth, not anger exactly. Just the weight of a man who had made a decision before he knocked and was now standing in the reality of it. "You lied to me," Caius said. Quiet. Level. The words hit harder because of that. Soren didn't step back. He stayed exactly where he was, one hand on the door frame, the other loose at his side, and he looked at Caius Okonkwo, the man who had stood in front of cameras 13 months ago and said the words that had dismantled everything. And he said clearly and without breaking, "No, I didn't." From somewhere behind him, he heard Kofi slide off the couch. Small footsteps crossed the floor. And then Kofi appeared beside Soren's leg, pajama top half tucked into his jeans, one small hand gripping the fabric of Soren's pants. And he looked up at the men in the doorway with the flat, unimpressed assessment of a 5-year-old who had not been consulted about any of this. Caius looked down. And for the first time since he'd arrived, he stopped. Not visibly, not dramatically, but something changed in his face. Something flickered. Soren watched it happen. He didn't name it. He just filed it away in the part of him that had learned the hard way to notice everything. Down the hall, a door opened. A neighbor. Then another. Phones were already up. Soren looked at Caius steadily. "You came here in front of cameras," he said. "In front of my children." Caius said nothing. "You've made your point." Soren's hand came down to rest lightly on Kofi's shoulder. "Now I need you to step back from my door." It was Zeke who shifted first, just slightly, just a half step. But Caius didn't move. His eyes were still on Kofi. specifically on Kofi's eyes. And whatever he saw there, whatever recognition moved through him in that moment, he swallowed it. Hard. Like a man who had just heard something true and was not ready to say so out loud. Soren began to close the door. He didn't slam it. He didn't need to. He closed it the way he did everything now. Quietly. With complete control. He stood with his back to it for a moment, listening to the hallway. Kofi was still pressed against his leg. Zara had appeared in the kitchen doorway, watching him with her arms crossed like a tiny, worried adult. Soren breathed in. Then he crouched down to Kofi's level, took the boy's face gently between his hands, and looked at him. "You okay?" Kofi considered the question with great seriousness. "Who was that man?" he asked. Soren smoothed down his son's collar for the second time that morning. He didn't answer right away. And in the silence of that small apartment, with the sound of the hallway fading and the TV still murmuring in the other room, something settled in Soren's chest. Not peace, not yet, but resolve. That night, after the children were asleep, a sealed white envelope appeared under the door. No knock, no footsteps leading up to it. Just there, on the floor, like it had been slid through by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had no interest in being seen doing it. Soren picked it up, turned it over. No return address, no name. He didn't open the envelope until midnight. Not because he was afraid of it, because Zara woke up twice. First from a bad dream she couldn't describe, and then because she thought she'd heard something outside the window, which turned out to be a pigeon. And by the time both children were fully settled and genuinely asleep, it was 11:52 and the apartment had finally gone quiet enough for him to think. He sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of him and a glass of water he hadn't touched. He opened it. Inside were 4 pages, photocopied, slightly uneven, like they'd been done in a hurry. Medical documents. His name was on them, or more precisely, the children's names were on them, and his name appeared in the Guardian field. The rest was dense clinical language, dates and codes and reference numbers that meant very little to him on their own. But he read every word, twice. By the time he set the pages down, it was past 1 in the morning, and something was sitting at the back of his mind that hadn't been there before. Not a full thought yet. More like the beginning of one. The shape of something that didn't fit where it had been placed. He stacked the pages. Put them back in the envelope. Put the envelope in the inner pocket of his jacket, which was hanging on the back of the chair. Then he went to the window. Outside, the street was mostly empty. A delivery driver was double parked down the block, hazards blinking orange every 2 seconds. No van. They'd moved it. Smart. Less obvious by night. But he knew they hadn't gone far. He'd been followed before. Photographed before. Had his words cut in half and reassembled into sentences he'd never said. He knew exactly how this machine worked, and he knew that engaging it, arguing with it, feeding it, giving it the emotional reaction it was built to harvest, only made it louder. So he wasn't going to do that. By the next morning, his name was already trending. Not because of anything he'd done. Because a neighbor, he never found out which one, had posted a video from the hallway. 14 seconds of footage. The doorway, the 3 men, Soren's face in profile, and then the door closing. The caption said, "He ran from the Alpha Kings and now they showed up at his door. The truth always comes out." 14 seconds. 700,000 views by 10 a.m. He didn't look at the comments. He'd made that decision early on, the day after the divorce was finalized, and he'd made the mistake of scrolling for 20 minutes before he had to put the phone down and go sit in the bathroom with the door locked while his hands stopped shaking. He didn't do that anymore. He took the children to the park instead. The same park they went to every Tuesday and Thursday 3 blocks east, with the good swings and the water fountain that worked and the bench under the oak tree where he could sit and see the whole playground at once. Zara ran straight to the swings. Kofi stopped at the edge of the sand and stared at a beetle for 4 full minutes before deciding to let it live. Soren sat on the bench. 2 people walked past with their phones out. He noticed. He didn't react. A woman with a stroller slowed down near him, looked at her screen, looked at him, and then kept moving. He watched Zara pump her legs and go higher. He watched Kofi finally step around the beetle with great ceremony and head toward the climbing structure. He didn't post anything, didn't make a statement, didn't call anyone to dispute the narrative that was being built in real time, on platforms he'd stopped using, by people who had never asked him a single question. This time, he was not going to beg to be believed. He'd done that once, in that courtroom lobby, with the cameras and the shouting and Caius walking ahead of him without turning around, and Soren saying quietly and then louder, and then in a voice that had broken in front of everyone, "Please just listen to me." And Caius hadn't turned around, and the cameras had caught all of it, every second. And the internet had decided, before he'd finished the sentence, that a man who begged like that was probably guilty of something. So no, not again. He protected what he could protect. He moved through the morning with his children beside him and his phone on silent and the envelope in his jacket pocket like a question he wasn't ready to ask out loud yet. And when they got back to the apartment that afternoon, Zara found a chalk drawing on the sidewalk out front. A heart, drawn by some neighbor's kid probably, meaning nothing. And she pointed at it and said, "Look, Papa, someone left us a present." He looked at it. "Yeah," he said. "They did. He made dinner. Pasta because it was fast and both children ate it without argument. He bathed them, read to them, turned off the light. He went back to the kitchen. He put the envelope on the table again, stared at it. Then, slowly, he pulled out the pages once more and started looking at the dates. The dates were what was bothering him. He couldn't articulate exactly why yet. Not fully. Just something in the sequence. Something in the spacing between one event and another that didn't align the way it should have. He wasn't a medical professional. He wasn't a lawyer. He didn't have the vocabulary for what he was looking at. But he was a man who had lived through the specific timeline these documents described. And he knew what had happened, and what these pages were describing. It wasn't quite that. He set the pages down, pressed his fingers against his mouth. The apartment was completely silent around him. And somewhere in that silence, a thought finished forming. He wasn't sure yet what it meant. But he was sure, for the first time in 13 months, that he wasn't as alone in this as he'd believed. Someone had sent him that envelope. Someone who knew something. And whatever was inside it, whatever these dates and codes and inconsistencies were trying to say, it was enough that someone had risked delivering it to his door in the middle of the night without leaving a name. That mattered. That meant something had already moved. He just didn't know yet what direction it was moving in. The dates didn't match. He went through them 3 times, once fast, once slowly, once with a notepad where he wrote out the sequence in plain language stripped of all the clinical codes, and every time he arrived at the same problem. The gap was wrong. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would jump out at someone who wasn't looking. Just off. By weeks. In a sequence that should have been clean and consecutive, there was a space that didn't belong. A processing date that came before the collection date that preceded it. A reference number that didn't follow the order of the ones around it. Small things. The kind of small things that got buried inside large documents because people trusted institutions and assumed the paperwork was right. Soren sat with the notepad in front of him and thought about that. He didn't have access to the full file. Whatever was in this envelope was partial, deliberately, he thought. Someone had given him just enough to see the shape of the problem without giving him the full picture. Either because they couldn't get more, or because they wanted him to ask for it. He took a photo of each page with his phone. Put the originals back in the envelope. Put the envelope between 2 books on the shelf where the children couldn't reach. Not hidden exactly, but out of the way. Then he called his friend. Amara Osei had been a medical records administrator for 11 years and was one of the sharpest people Soren knew. She was also, more importantly, someone who had been angry on his behalf since the day the divorce proceedings went public and had told him, in no uncertain terms, that if he ever needed her to look at something with professional eyes, he should call. She picked up on the second ring. "It's early," she said. I know. I'm sorry. You never call early unless something's wrong. A pause. What happened? He told her. Not everything, just the part about the envelope and the dates and the gap that didn't add up. He kept his voice even. Steady. He'd gotten good at that. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Send me the photos, she said. He did. 3 minutes passed. Soren. Yeah. This processing date is flagged wrong. Her voice had changed. It had gone professional, not cold, but focused. The way she sounded when she was working. This shouldn't come before the collection. That's not how the chain of custody works for this kind of record. If this went through a lab, there would be a timestamp at intake. The intake timestamp here is... She stopped. He waited. Where did you get this? Under my door. No name. Another silence. You need the full file, she said. Not just these pages. The chain of custody documents, the lab intake records, the original submission form. All of it. I know. These pages alone aren't proof of anything. They're a door, Soren. They show you where to look. But you'd need the rest. I understand. Do you want me to look into who might have filed the original? Not yet. He said it carefully. He didn't want to pull her into something that could come back on her professionally. Not before he knew what he was actually dealing with. Not yet. Let me figure out a few things first. Okay. She didn't push. But Soren, if these dates are wrong the way I think they are, that means the processing wasn't accidental. Someone would have had to input this information, and then it would have had to be accepted. That doesn't happen by mistake. He already knew that. He thanked her and ended the call. He sat for a long time. Across town. Though Soren didn't know this yet, and wouldn't until much later. Caius Okonkwo was sitting in the main office of the Okonkwo family building with the door closed and a file open on the desk in front of him that one of his own people had placed there 40 minutes ago without saying a word. Darius stood at the window with his arms crossed and his back to the room. Zeke was sitting on the edge of the desk reading something on his phone, and when Caius looked up from the file, Zeke set the phone down. Talk, Caius said. Darius turned around. The lab tech who processed the original submission, Darius said. We've been trying to reach him for a follow-up verification. Standard stuff. Caius waited. He's not reachable. Darius's voice was flat. Not unavailable. Not on vacation. Not out of office. He paused. Unreachable. Like someone made sure of it. The room went still. Caius looked back at the file. The dates. At the chain of custody documents his team had quietly requested 2 days ago when the questions started piling up in ways he hadn't expected. He pressed 2 fingers against the line on the page where the timeline broke. Right there. That exact spot. Find him, he said. Darius nodded once. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet apartment where 2 children were just beginning to wake up and a man was standing at the kitchen window watching the morning come in, the same set of dates was sitting on a notepad. 2 people. Same question. Neither of them knowing yet that they were already moving toward the same answer. He was 9 years old the first time he understood what it meant to not be believed. Not by Caius. Long before Caius. It had been a teacher, a school, a misunderstanding about something small that Soren couldn't even fully reconstruct now. Just the feeling of it. The specific helplessness of saying something true and watching the person across from you decide, for their own reasons, that your version of events was inconvenient. He'd carried that feeling through his whole life like a splinter too deep to reach. And then he'd met Caius Okonkwo. He remembered the first version of him. Not the man who had stood in that courtroom lobby. The earlier one, 3 years earlier, the one who had shown up at a mutual friend's dinner party and spent 40 minutes in the kitchen talking to Soren about nothing in particular. Jazz, traffic, the specific misery of airport food. Nothing important. But Caius had listened. Really listened the way people rarely do. Not waiting for his turn to talk, but actually receiving what Soren said and responding to it like it mattered. He'd thought, this one is different. He'd been right. For a while. The distance didn't come all at once. That was the thing about it. The thing Soren had spent a long time trying to put into words and had eventually stopped trying. It came the way cracks come in old buildings. You don't see the fracture forming. You just notice one day that something that used to hold weight no longer does. Caius had power in the way that very few people have power. Not just wealth and position, though he had both, but the kind that other people organized themselves around. People deferred to him without being asked to. Rooms adjusted when he entered them. And at first Soren had found that remarkable. Magnetic. Like standing close to something that generates its own heat. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to feel less like he was standing beside it and more like he was standing in its shadow. Caius didn't do it intentionally. Soren had spent a long time deciding whether that made it better or worse. He'd concluded worse, because intention could be corrected. Unawareness just kept going. The accusations had started after the pregnancy. Not from Caius directly, not at first. From the periphery. From people who had opinions about Soren that they delivered in the carefully neutral language of concern. I just want to make sure you know what you're getting into. I hope the timing adds up the way you're saying it does. You understand how this looks. He had gone to Caius. He'd said, "People are saying things. I need you to hear me." And Caius had listened. Soren would give him that. He'd been present in the room, eyes on Soren's face, everything that looked like attention. But somewhere in the machinery of that attention, the transmission had failed. Because afterward, the people with their concerns were still present. Still in Caius's orbit. Still being consulted. And Soren's version of events, which was the true version, which was the only version that had actually happened, began to feel less like a fact and more like a perspective. One of several. Subject to debate. He tried again. 3 more times before the court date. Each time Caius had listened. Each time nothing had changed. And on the day of the formal proceedings, Soren had stood in that lobby and said, "Please, just listen to me." And Caius had kept walking. That had been the moment. Not the signing of papers. Not the verdict. Not the cameras or the headlines or the things that were said about him on platforms he'd since deleted. The walking away. That was what had broken something. Not in a dramatic way. No collapse, no tears, no long night on the floor. Just a clean, quiet break. The kind that happens when something has been under stress for long enough. When the material finally gives. He thought about all of this now not with bitterness. He'd been surprised to discover, somewhere around month 9, that the bitterness had mostly burned itself out, but with a strange clarity. Like looking at an old photograph and understanding something about the lighting that you couldn't see when you were inside it. He had loved Caius. He wasn't going to revise that. But love and trust were not the same thing. And trust, once broken at that specific depth, not the surface kind, not a misunderstanding. The structural kind, the kind that holds the whole architecture up, did not just rebuild because someone said sorry. He was thinking about this on a Thursday afternoon when Zara climbed into his lap without warning and pressed her face against his chest and said nothing at all. He wrapped his arms around her. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do. Inside, the apartment was warm and quiet and exactly the size of what he'd been able to build. And that, Soren thought, was enough. It was going to have to be enough. For now. He pressed his lips against the top of Zara's head and held her there. "Papa." Her voice was muffled against his shirt. "Right here." She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. They sat like that until Kofi came in from the hallway dragging a blanket and announced, with great authority, that it was snack time. It wasn't. But Soren got up anyway. He was in the kitchen cutting an apple when his phone buzzed. Not a call. A message. From a number he didn't recognize, different from the one on the envelope, different from the hospital. Just a string of digits and, beneath them, 5 words. Check the lab technician's name. That was it. No other context. No follow-up message. Soren stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he set down the knife. Picked up the envelope from between the books. went through the pages until he found the name on the processing documents. He read it once, then again. His hands went completely still. He knew that name. If Soren already knows who the lab technician is, and what that connection means, drop a comment right now. Because what comes next changes everything. And if you've ever had someone from your past walk back into your life right when you'd finally made peace with losing them, Kofi's fever spiked at 2 in the morning. Not gradually. Not with warning signs that built across the evening. One moment he was asleep, small and still under his dinosaur blanket, and the next he was burning. Skin hot to the touch, breathing too fast, eyes glassy in the way that made every parent's stomach drop straight through the floor. Soren had him dressed and in a cab within 8 minutes. He didn't call anyone. Didn't post anything. Didn't think about envelopes or lab technicians or the name he'd read on that processing document the night before. All of that went somewhere else. Some sealed compartment, because right now there was only Kofi. Kofi's hand in his. Kofi's head resting heavy against his shoulder in the back of the cab while the city moved past the windows in streaks of orange and white. The emergency intake nurse at St. Aurelius took one look at Kofi's temperature reading and moved fast. Soren sat in the children's ward waiting area with Zara asleep across his lap. She'd refused to stay home, had already been awake when he was getting Kofi dressed, had stood in the hallway in her pajamas with her arms crossed and said, simply, "I'm coming." And he watched the door where they'd taken Kofi, and he did not let himself think about worst cases. He was good at that now. Controlling what he let himself think about. An hour passed. Then a doctor came out. Young, direct, carrying a tablet, and told him that Kofi had a respiratory infection, that his oxygen levels had dipped slightly but were coming back up, and that they wanted to keep him overnight for observation and for fluids. Nothing life-threatening. But they needed to watch him. Soren nodded, asked the right questions, signed the forms they put in front of him. Then he sat back down. Zara stirred in his lap. Is Kofi okay? He's going to be okay. Promise. He looked down at her face in the fluorescent light of the waiting room, serious and searching, waiting for a real answer, not a soft one. Yes, he said. I promise. She settled back against him. He looked at the ceiling. At some point, he wasn't sure exactly when, because the waiting room had blurred into a gray stretch of chairs and distant Pennsylvania announcements and the occasional squeak of rubber-soled shoes. He became aware that the chair 2 seats down from him was no longer empty. He didn't have to look. He already knew. He looked anyway. Caius Okonkwo was sitting in a hospital waiting room chair in a dark jacket. No tie, like a man who had left somewhere important in a hurry. His elbows were on his knees. His hands were loosely clasped. He was not looking at Soren. He was looking at Zara. Not in a threatening way. Not with any expression that could be easily named. Just looking. The way people look at something that has surprised them. Something they weren't prepared for. Soren said nothing. Caius said nothing. 30 seconds passed in complete silence between them, with the hospital going about its business around them and Zara asleep and oblivious in the space between. Then Caius said quietly, "How is he?" Soren didn't answer right away. He let the question sit. Then, respiratory infection. Overnight observation. Caius nodded once. Slow. More silence. Soren watched him sideways. Not turning his head, just using the edge of his vision. And he saw something he hadn't expected to see. Not guilt. Not calculation. Not the careful, managed expression of a man managing optics. Just a person. Sitting in a hospital chair at 3 in the morning because a child he'd spent 13 months denying was sick. That mattered. He wasn't going to say so out loud. But it mattered. A nurse passed. The PA system crackled. Someone down the hall said something in a low, urgent tone, and then footsteps moved away quickly. Caius unclasped his hands, pressed one of them flat against his knee. Soren, don't. I'm not. Caius. Soren's voice was level. Not hard, just final. Not here. Not tonight. Caius closed his mouth. He stayed. He didn't leave, didn't stand up, didn't offer anything else, didn't try to speak again. He just stayed. In the chair 2 seats down, present and quiet, while the hours moved and the waiting room stayed the same. At one point, a doctor walked past and paused near them. Not Kofi's doctor, a different one, and looked at the chart in her hand and then at the chart on the wall behind them and said, almost to herself, "We need to recheck previous records. The intake documents from the last visit aren't matching the current baseline." She walked on, hadn't been talking to either of them, but the words landed between them like something thrown. Soren felt Caius go still beside him. Still in a way that was different from the stillness of waiting. The stillness of someone who had just heard a sentence that hit a nerve they were already pressing on. Soren didn't look at him. He looked at the door where his son was sleeping, and he waited. Darius found it on a Tuesday, not through the hospital, not through any official channel, through a name, the one Soren had found on the processing documents, the one that had made his hands go still in the kitchen that night. A name that, when Darius ran it through their network, came back attached to 2 things. A lab technician's license, and a wire transfer. 3 of them, actually, spread across 14 months. Each one modest enough to avoid automatic flagging. Each one originating from an account that, when traced back through 2 shell layers, connected to a family name that Caius recognized immediately. He read the document twice. Then he set it down on the desk and didn't touch it for a long time. Zeke was standing by the door. He hadn't said anything since handing it over. He was waiting. Darius was at the window again. Same position as before. Arms crossed. Back to the room. Like the city outside was easier to look at than whatever was happening behind him. Caius pressed 2 fingers against his mouth. The room was very quiet. The records were altered, Caius said. Not a question. Altered and submitted, Darius said without turning around. The original DNA processing. The chain of custody, it was broken. On purpose. Whoever submitted the final report swapped the processing date with the collection date and changed the reference numbers. It would look like an administrative error to anyone not specifically looking for it. But it wasn't. No. Caius picked up the document again. The wire transfers. The name on the lab license. The name behind the account. He'd trusted that person. Not closely, not the way he trusted his brothers, but in the peripheral way that people in his position trusted the people in their orbit. Extended circle. Long-standing connection. Someone who had raised a concern about Soren with the careful, practiced neutrality of someone who only wanted what was best. He thought about that now. The specific language of it. I just want to make sure you have the full picture. There are things about the timing that don't add up. I know this is hard to hear, but someone in your position can't afford to. He'd listened. He'd weighed it against what Soren had said. And somewhere in that weighing, somewhere in the decision to treat 2 very different things as equivalent, as competing perspectives of equal value, he had made the choice that had ended his marriage. That thought moved through him slowly. The full weight of it. He'd been wrong. Not misled, though that was true. Not deceived, though that was also true. Those were real. But they were also convenient. They let the error sit somewhere outside of him. In someone else's hands. The harder truth was this, Soren had told him. Not once. For times. With increasing urgency and decreasing composure because the man was watching his own life be taken apart and the person he trusted most was treating his account of it like one side of a story. Caius had listened, and then he had walked away. He set the document down again. Where is the technician now? He asked. Out of state, Zeke said from the door. We located him this morning. He's willing to give a formal statement. And the transfers? Documented. Full chain. Caius nodded. The anger was there. He could feel it, the specific cold anger of a man who has discovered that he was used as a tool. But it was secondary. It wasn't the loudest thing in the room. The loudest thing was the image of Soren in that lobby. Please, just listen to me. Darius finally turned around from the window. He looked at Caius directly. No softening. No buffer. Just the direct gaze of a man who had watched his brother do something irreversible and was not going to pretend otherwise. "You know what you have to do," Darius said. "I know. You going to do it right this time?" Caius looked at the document, at the name on the wire transfers, at the broken chain of custody that had cost Soren 13 months of his life and 2 children their right to a father who had simply been told the truth. "Yes," he said. He stood up. "I'm going alone." Soren answered the door on the first knock. Not because he was expecting it. Because Zara had left her shoes in the hallway the night before and he'd been meaning to bring them in. And he happened to be crossing the apartment when the knock came. So he just opened it. Caius was alone. No brothers. No team. No cameras, though Soren checked the hallway automatically, old reflex, and there was nobody. Just Caius, standing in the corridor of a mid-rise apartment building in a jacket he'd clearly been wearing since early morning. Looking like a man who had been rehearsing something and had just decided to stop rehearsing. Soren held the door. He didn't invite him in immediately. He just waited. Caius met his eyes. "I was wrong," he said. 3 words. No preamble. No qualifier. No carefully constructed sentence designed to distribute responsibility across multiple parties. Just that. Soren studied him. Not looking for sincerity, he'd become too good at reading Caius to need to look for it. Either it was there or it wasn't, and it was, but deciding what to do with it. Where to file it. What it changed and what it didn't. He stepped back. Caius came inside. The apartment was quiet. The children were at Amara's for the afternoon. She'd insisted when she'd heard about the hospital night. Had arrived that morning with food and a tote bag and the energy of someone prepared to not take no for an answer. So it was just the 2 of them, in a space that Soren had built entirely without Caius. Without his name on the lease or his money in the account or his presence in any of the small decisions that had made it into something livable. Caius looked around. He didn't comment on it, but something in his face, something careful and a little ashamed, said he was registering exactly what he was looking at. They sat at the kitchen table, not across from each other dramatically, just at the table. The same table where the envelope had been, where the notepad with the dates had been, where Soren had sat at 1 in the morning working through a truth that should have been handed to him 3 years ago. Caius set a folder on the table. "The lab technician falsified the processing records," he said. "The chain of custody was broken deliberately. The DNA results that were submitted to the court were valid, the children are mine, but the timeline was manipulated to create the impression of an inconsistency in the pregnancy dates. Someone paid for that manipulation. We have the transfers. We have a statement." Soren looked at the folder. He didn't open it. "I know," he said. Caius looked at him. "You already. I've known something was wrong with those dates for weeks. Since the envelope." Pause. "Someone sent you something." "Yes." Caius absorbed that. "Who?" "I don't know yet." The table was quiet between them. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere above them, footsteps crossed a floor. "I should have listened to you," Caius said. He said it directly. No hedging in it. "You told me. You told me 4 times. And I weighted what you said against what someone else told me like they were equal. Like your account of your own life needed to compete with someone else's version of it." He stopped. "That was wrong. It was wrong before the trial, and it was wrong in that lobby, and He stopped again. "I've been thinking about the fact that you said please, and I kept walking." The room held that. Soren felt it, the old wound, the one that had closed mostly, pulling slightly at the edges. He didn't look away from Caius. He didn't break. "I know you were wrong," Soren said. Not with heat. Not with the sharp edge of a man who had been waiting to deliver a line. Just plainly, the way you state a fact. "I know you were wrong," he said again. "I've known it the whole time. Knowing it didn't make it easier. It made it harder. Because I couldn't even tell myself you had a good reason." Caius didn't flinch. He took it. "The person who arranged this," Soren said. Are you handling it? Yes. Formally? Through proper channels. Yes. Full documentation. Legal process. Nothing quiet about it. Soren nodded once. He looked at the folder again. Then he pushed it slightly to the side. Not away, just aside. Like it was relevant but not central. The children, he said. Kofi is better. Home tomorrow. Zara is, he paused. She's been asking questions I don't have good answers to yet. Caius was very still. What kind of questions? Soren looked at him. The kind that 5-year-olds ask when they can tell the adults around them are carrying something heavy and nobody will explain what it is. That landed. He watched it land. Caius pressed his hands flat on the table. Looked down at them for a moment. Then looked up. Can we fix this? He asked. The apartment was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Soren held the question. Not performing hesitation. Genuinely sitting inside it. Because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer and the real answer was not simple and he was not going to rush it. He looked at the man across from him. At the face he'd known for 4 years. At the jaw and the eyes and the way Caius held himself when he was uncertain, which most people never saw because most people never got close enough. He used to be close enough. Soren breathed in. Said nothing. The silence stretched. And Caius, to his credit, to the credit of whatever had changed in him during 13 months of consequences, did not push, did not fill the space, did not try to argue his way into an answer. He waited, and Soren sat with the question and the room and the weight of everything that had been broken, and said nothing yet. He walked by himself the next morning. Not far, just around the block once before the children woke up. He did this sometimes. Left a note on the kitchen table in case they woke early, put his phone in his pocket, and went outside while the city was still half asleep and the air was cold enough to make thinking easier. He walked. He thought. He had spent 4 years loving Caius Okonkwo. 3 of them inside the marriage. One of them, the longest one, the one that felt like 10, outside of it. And he had carried that love the way people carry things they no longer have a use for but cannot bring themselves to leave behind. Not bitterly, just with him, part of the weight. He understood somewhere around month 6 that love and worth were not the same calculation. He had loved Caius. That had never been the problem. The problem was simpler and harder than love. It was that he had spent years making himself smaller to fit inside someone else's certainty. Adjusting his volume, editing his instincts, choosing the version of himself that created the least friction in the room. And when it had mattered most, when his life was being decided, the version of himself he'd been practicing had not been enough. Because it wasn't built for fighting. It was built for accommodating. He'd had to rebuild from that. He'd had to find out, in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city, with 2 small children and very little money and absolutely no audience, what he was actually made of when there was nothing left to manage. Turned out more than he'd thought. He walked to the corner and stood there for a moment. A dog walker passed with 3 large dogs, all pulling in separate directions. A delivery truck idled outside a bakery. Steam rose from a vent in the sidewalk. He thought about Caius's question. Can we fix this? He thought about what that would look like. Practically. Not romantically. He'd moved past the romantic version of it months ago, quietly and without ceremony. But practically. 2 people. 2 children. A history that included real love and real damage in roughly equal measure. He thought about Zara's face when she'd asked him if he was okay. 5 years old. Already watching him for signs. He was not going to raise his daughter to watch the people she loved for signs. He was going to raise her to expect to be heard. To believe her own account of her own life. To know, in the deep, foundational way, not just as a concept, that love that requires you to shrink yourself is not the right size. He couldn't teach her that from inside a reconciliation he'd agreed to because someone had finally apologized. Forgiveness wasn't the problem. He'd already done that. Quietly, weeks ago, in the kitchen at 1 in the morning, when he'd realized that holding on to the anger was just another way of staying connected to something that was over. He'd let it go. That was done. But forgiveness was not the same as returning. And returning was not something he owed anyone. Not even someone who had finally, genuinely, correctly said I was wrong. You didn't get access to a person's life just because you'd admitted the cost of losing it. He turned around. Started back toward the apartment. The morning was getting lighter. Pale blue at the edges of the buildings, the kind of light that came in sideways and made ordinary things look considered. He thought about the children waking up. Kofi asking for cereal. Zara needing her inhaler before she did anything else. The full, specific, non-negotiable weight of a morning that belonged to him. He walked back inside. Up the stairs. He'd taken the stairs every day for 13 months because the elevator was slow and because moving helped him think. He opened the apartment door. Both children were awake. Kofi was on the couch wrapped in his blanket. Still pale from the hospital but eating crackers with the focused intensity of someone recovering and hungry about it. Zara was at the kitchen table drawing something with a red crayon. She'd been on a red phase for weeks, and she looked up when he came in. "Where'd you go?" "Around the block. You left a note." "I always leave a note." She went back to her drawing. He took off his jacket, put his keys on the hook, made coffee. When Caius called that afternoon, Soren picked up. He listened. He let Caius say what he'd come to say, all of it without interrupting, and then he sat with it for a moment before he answered. "I forgive you," Soren said. Pause. "But I won't return." The line was quiet. Not the quiet of anger or rejection. Just quiet. The honest kind. "The children need you in their lives," Soren continued. "That's real and I mean it. We can build something that works for them. Co-parenting. Consistency. Stability. But what we had, I'm not rebuilding that. Not because I can't. Because I've decided not to." Another pause. "That's it?" Caius asked. Quietly. "That's it. No ultimatum in it. No door left open for a different answer. Just a decision. Final. Made by a man who had walked around the block that morning and come back certain." Caius didn't argue. That was the thing that surprised Soren most. And didn't surprise him at all. Because the version of Caius that had walked into that apartment 2 days ago was not the version that had walked away in that lobby. Something in him had shifted. Whether it would hold, whether it was real change or just grief wearing the clothes of change, that wasn't Soren's responsibility to evaluate anymore. He'd made his decision. He was done carrying things that weren't his to carry. "Okay," Caius said. One word. Soren exhaled. "I'll have Amara reach out to coordinate the schedule," he said. "For the children." "Okay. Good." He ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with his phone in his hand and the coffee cooling behind him and the sound of Zara and Kofi in the other room. Zara explaining something with great authority, Kofi disagreeing with equal authority. Filling the apartment. He set the phone down. He picked up his coffee. He was okay. More than okay. He was exactly where he'd decided to be. For months past. Not quietly, nothing with 2 children under 6 was quiet, but steadily. The way things move when the chaos has finally found its shape and you've stopped fighting the shape and started working inside it. Soren moved. Not far. 15 minutes north, into a building with a better school district and a playground on the roof that Kofi immediately declared the greatest thing he'd ever seen. The apartment was bigger. Not by much, but enough for the children to have their own room. Enough for a corner where Soren kept his desk and the work he'd started taking on again. Enough that the walls didn't feel like they were listening to him think. He painted Zara's room yellow. Her idea. He'd offered several other colors. She'd looked at the paint samples with the seriousness of a contractor and pointed at the brightest one without hesitation. Yellow it was. He painted Kofi's room blue and let him put stickers on the closet door, which meant the closet door now had 47 dinosaur stickers on it, and Soren had decided this was fine. Caius came every other weekend. Punctual. Prepared. He showed up with the right snacks and the right energy and the kind of careful, genuine attention of a man who understood he was earning something that didn't come automatically. He took the children to the park. Helped with homework that was still mostly drawings and letter recognition. read to them at bedtime when he was there. He did not push for more. He didn't try to use the children as leverage for a conversation Soren had already closed. He didn't engineer moments or linger past pickup time or send messages that weren't about logistics. That was unexpected. Not unwelcome. Just unexpected. Soren had prepared himself for the version of Caius that couldn't accept a final answer. He'd had contingency plans, exit strategies, words he'd rehearsed for the conversation where lines needed to be redrawn. He didn't need them. Whether that was growth or consequence or simply a man who had lost enough to finally understand the shape of what he'd had, Soren didn't spend time analyzing it. That wasn't his work anymore. His work was this. Tuesday mornings walking Zara to school, her hand in his, her backpack enormous relative to her body, her running commentary on every dog and bird and crack in the sidewalk they passed. Thursday afternoons picking Kofi up early so they could get to the good library before it got crowded. Kofi picking books by cover alone in a method that was chaotic and had produced some genuinely excellent results. Friday evenings with Amara and her husband and their kids. Takeout on the living room floor, everyone talking over each other. A life, specific and real and entirely his. He took a freelance project in the spring, communications work for a nonprofit he believed in, and sat at his corner desk while the children slept and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not just competence, satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of work that was yours because you chose it. He didn't think about Caius every day anymore. That had happened gradually. Not one clear morning where the thought was absent. Just a slow recession, like a tide going out. Some days he crossed the whole day without the thought arriving. Some days something small would trigger it. A song, a particular kind of light, the specific weight of a silence, and it would come and he would let it and then it would go again. That was what healing actually looked like. Not a switch. A tide. One evening in early April, he was sitting on the couch with Zara after dinner. Kofi had fallen asleep 20 minutes earlier, extraordinary given that it was only 7:30, but the park had been ambitious that day. Zara was awake and fighting it. She always fought it. Sitting beside Soren with her legs tucked under her and her eyes at half-mast while he read to her in a low voice from a book about a rabbit who wanted to be an astronaut. She made it through 2 more pages. Then she was out. He sat for a while after, not moving because she was warm against his arm and the apartment was quiet in the specific, earned way that only comes after a full day, and he didn't want to disturb any of it. He thought about the line he'd said into the phone that afternoon 4 months ago. He didn't break me. He thought about how long it had taken him to believe that fully. Not as a statement, the statement had come easily enough. As a fact. In his body. In the reflexes that had slowly stopped bracing for impact and started just moving through the day without armor. That had taken time. That had taken the whole 13 months and then some. He looked at Zara sleeping against him. At her face in the lamplight. Open and total the way only children sleep. Every part of her at rest. No part of her guarded. He'd done that. Built something safe enough that she could sleep like that. He was going to keep building it. He reached over carefully and turned off the lamp. Sat in the quiet. Wasn't afraid of it. Then small voice. Almost asleep. Barely there. Papa. Right here. A pause. Her breathing changed. Slower. Almost gone. Will you ever love him again? He didn't answer right away. Sat with the question in the dark. Outside, the city moved. Inside, a man who had walked through fire and chosen, deliberately, carefully, for no one's benefit but his own and his children's, to come out the other side not harder but clearer. He thought about love. About what it was and what it wasn't. About the difference between loving someone and needing someone and building your life around someone and building your life and letting someone else exist within it. Zara's breathing deepened. She was asleep. The question hung there anyway. He let it. And the apartment held them both. The sleeping child and the man who had finally stopped waiting to become someone. In the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. He didn't break me. He just forced me to become someone who no longer needed him. That's the end of this story. And if something in it hit differently, if you've ever had to choose yourself when staying felt easier, drop a comment below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. This channel exists for stories like this one. Stories about strength that doesn't announce itself. About people who rebuild quietly without applause and come out the other side. If the story moved you, subscribe, turn on notifications, share it with someone who's in the middle of their own chapter 10, and come back, because there are more stories coming. Stories that remind you that survival isn't just possible. It's something you can build a whole life inside of.